Speakers, ladies and gentlemen, the motto that we chose today is that I openly declare that I have no hesitation in telling you with perfect candor that the conditions of peace without certain essential modification appear unacceptable for my country. This is because when Apanyi told his speech, he said that either refuse the peace or opt for it will raise whether we should commit suicide in order to avoid death. These are the thoughts that refer to the fact that at that time Hungarian elite had a great responsibility in their hands. And at the same time, Endre Ady, in January 1914, wrote his beautiful poem about the diaspora. About that, I would like to raise only one motive, that we Hungarians before the war, well, this is that he predicts about the diaspora. We Hungarians, we did not build up the church. And I'm actually quite delighted to share with you that after in 2010, this temple is the temple of the nations belonging together. So this conference, which is about the effect and impact of the Trianon Peace Conference with 10 speakers, I very much hope that it will contribute to making sure that building of this temple and the very conscious responsibility taken beyond the borders for the Hungarians who live beyond the borders should contribute to a better understanding. We have 10 speakers. May I kindly request our first speaker, Mihály Nánay, who is the president of the Professional Association of History Teachers, to deliver his presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome you all. The first presentation of this conference will discuss the role of Charles IV, because the road leading to the Versailles Treaty, we can actually start from various points and angles. We go back to 1918, and we here would like to examine the Charles in the moment of the breakdown. You know, his rule was very short. It was only 4 years, and these were the war years. So it would be very good, therefore, see how it was all embedded in the history. But actually, there will be some preliminaries going back before 1918. So is he a main character or just a person who plays a supporting role? Well, if we recall all these events, probably most of you remember Károly and Tisza or Béla Kun returning by train from Russia, or some similar politicians. And it's strange that the king, who is the head of state and who might be having various important roles to play, and he still did not someone who we consider as a person playing important role in that part of the history. Why? Because his room for maneuvering was quite small. We are in a constitutional monarchy, we are in the war period. None of the rulers could retain their throne like William, or in the like the Sultan was also brought down. But let's not have unrealistic expectations to Charles IV. But it is still quite justified to ask why he did not play an important role. Well, simply because he was not a character of that type. His indecisiveness, or sometimes his very arrogant personality, led to the fact that he was not actually exploiting fully his room for maneuvering. Let's not forget that he was the most important warlord. As we said, that Charles IV took over the responsibility of overseeing the army, and he was also the one who could nominate ministers and prime ministers as as well. Of course, in the case of nominating Tisza, this was the case. And if the monarchy had a very bad results in something, that's the foreign policy. And I also read that Foreign Minister Czernin, who was in charge of the monarchy's foreign policy since the winter of 1916, some said that it would have been to have an Austrian better, because he wouldn't have caused so much damage. Let me call another interesting analogy, but let me reiterate again that we should not have unrealistic expectations vis-à-vis the king, because his room for maneuvering was very, very limited. But we know some examples from the Second World War where the personality of the king turned around the fate of a country, like Mussolini, Antonescu. But of course, this is mutatis mutandis, so it is not applicable everywhere. All those political considerations that are voiced here are important to be separated from the personality of Charles IV. It is not by accident that he was beatificated. He was actually a person with a holy life. He was very much convinced about the faith and religion. He was quite depressed about the war. He actually wanted peace very much. Of course, his deeds were not enough for that. Social justice. We say that he could have been the best ever Habsburg ruler in peacetime, because he could have provided good opportunities to reform dualism. He had 8 children, he had a love marriage with his wife, and of course after his death there were some miracles also justified. People recovered, and some decades later his body was found undamaged in his coffin. So he was actually a person, as I said, who was beatified, and his personality can be therefore separated from his political career. And we can say that Charles IV is the only Habsburg king who has a statue in Budapest, except for Maria Theresia, who has a statue in Goodwill, but all the other Habsburg kings have statues in some storehouses covered with dust. So it's interesting still that Charles IV, under whose rule the monarchy collapsed, and it was a tragic ruling still, and probably it's the beatification that induced this. This is near Deák tér in Budapest on Károly körút, and it's strangely a picture where you can see István Tisza, who was the dictator of the monarchy, who actually at the very beginning of Charles IV ruling started to dictate him what to do. Well, preparation. Was Charles IV prepared to be a ruler? Well, he is not the first heir to the throne. Here, this is the dynasty of the Habsburg house. And you can see that Ferdinand V was actually incompetent in the case of Franz Joseph. Once again, we can call about Rudolf, but you know, Charles IV is Franz Joseph's grandchildren's side, which actually meant quite a big handicap. And he had before him Rudolf, the heir to the throne, and Franz Ferdinand, who was actually assassinated in 1914. Although, as I said, that Ferenc Ferdinand's marriage was morganatic, so that's why his successors were excluded from being the inheritors of the throne. So one could already presuppose that after Franz Ferdinand, it will be the side of Charles IV that will come or succeed. But he was not prepared, he was not introduced into the secrets of ruling. And I put here a very interesting quote by Tisza, who actually handed over a Hungarian public law memorandum for an heir to the throne, which was actually quite humiliating. But he actually just said as an explanation that it is meant to help this person with a good spirit to kind of get out of the prejudices. István Tisza was not too keen that the inexperienced and young Charles IV should intervene into his affairs, and the reason why I put his date of birth here, because he was not 30 when he took the throne at the beginning of the World War, although Franz Joseph was quite a difference. But he was considered to be quite an unexperienced prince, and actually everybody considered him to be quite unexperienced. It did happen that sometimes a head of a department brought the message from Tisza to the king. And Konrad, who was the chief of staff, he simply missed him out from the decision-making. Charles IV had actually a very interesting aspect, his serving on the front. Here you can see with art, and he was actually already a he was already a king, so he was supposed to become a soldier, because this was a career that was so available in the time of dualism. So he was not supposed to be a prime minister, but he was supposed to be good in the military career. But he had a very low rank at the beginning of the war, so this was a problem that was difficult to bridge. So that's why Franz Joseph commissioned him to do some representative duties in order to prevent an unexperienced crown prince to get into situations which would not be too fair to them. And Konrad's hostile feelings against him are also worthwhile to be noted. But of course, this was quite a big risk of dying on the front, which was a major risk to the dynasty, and because his successor was born in 1912, and this would have been an unprecedented consequences that in the case Franz Joseph dies, a 4-year-old should take the throne. So then he was commissioned to pursue a major offensive in 1916 in the spring. This was something that he did, and ever since he was a chief of staff, Konrad actually wanted to take that. So he had already designed how he could win over the Italians, and actually it was probably the Italian kingdom which was the most hated enemy of the Habsburgs, which took Venice and Lombardy from them, and Konrad shared this idea. And this very well prepared offensive that could have started off from the Alps to the south by a secret mission. Well, this 20th division was led by Charles, the crown prince, and it was quite a successful start. The Brusilov offensive, however, made the offensive impossible, but then he was assigned to go to Transylvania, and for quite some time there were 3 armies that belonged to him. And of course, the German allies were not too happy that they had an unexperienced crown prince leading the army. And actually, they assigned assigned to him another chief military officer who would be making the decisions. But finally, as a conclusion, we can say that he managed to collect enough experience on the front, and as such, he was in charge of the commander of the army. But you know, Franz Joseph was not in charge of the army, but it was Frederick who was the one who took it from him. How did then he enter into the throne, and what were the changes that were taking place? I do not want to go into the nitty-gritties of that because it's quite a complicated discussion, but this was the last coronation in December 1916, because in November Franz Joseph died, but then it was a big debate who should replace the Palatine, but you know, since 1849, they did not have a Palatine in Hungary. In fact, the Prime Minister was actually elected for 1 day, so based on that, István Tisza should have played that role, but Tisza was already at that time a controversial personality, so the opposition was attacking him very much in the parliament, so this became a very grave political debate, but Tisza insisted, and you can see that in the background, next to János Csernok, there is Tisza as well, who is the deputy Palatine. Well, this was the first wind of change, so to speak, because nobody liked this big and fierce fight against each other. And again, in peacetime, everything would have been different. But what we see here is that during his reign, he could not implement anything. It's easy to say that, yes, there was war, so it's not possible. But his indecisive personality played a very important role in it. But still, it's quite interesting that when he made a decision, he was sticking to it, which is again not a good feature. Probably Professor Újvári remembers that there was a Veritas event. They said that the king of sudden decisions, well, this was the title. And he actually moved and drove away people who had strong personalities. He replaced the chief of staff, the minister of foreign affairs, and also Körber, the minister, and Tisza was also sent away. Although if someone had some ideas about how to operate a country in war, how to get the supplies, it was Tisza. Well, experiments and failures. Suffrage, this is probably the most important thing, but the reform of suffrage was not passing through the parliament because Tisza had a majority with his party. And they said, people say that if that resilience which Franz Joseph had was to be seen in the case of Charles IV, he could have fared better. But Tisza failed and nothing changed. And again, an independent Hungarian army, Charles IV was supporting this idea, but this all failed because of the generals. And the AOK is the generals in the military, so they failed. Actually, the king was socially very, very sensitive, so he could have been more open to the issues of dualism as well. But unfortunately, none of these things were implemented. The war made it absolutely impossible. Nevertheless, the efforts to make peace are also good examples for showing this indecisive personality. You can see Emperor William and Charles IV are looking at each other, but it was as if Charles IV was supposed to report to the emperor. I mean, there was an age difference as well, but then again, the personal relations are appearing here as well. So the background is very important, but also the personality. Let me reiterate, however, that Charles IV was committed to peace, but even his commitment did not end up in the piece like William's non-commitment. I do not want to go into the Sixtus affair, which was quite an interesting experiment to make peace. But the real move that they could have stepped out of the war was not something that he would have committed himself to. And also, of course, the appearance of the Germans convinced a lot of the Entente powers that the monarchy cannot be sustained. In the turmoil of the breakdown and total collapse, it is actually quite unhistorical to set some unrealistic expectations to the king. None of the other rulers were able to retain their thrones or their power. Even the kings of the ancien regimes were already brought down. But in September, October 1918, we can see the dualisms and monarchies still existing structures got into a paralyzed situation. So instead of working out a quick fix or a fast program, we see no signs of it, and there were also a lot of diplomatic failures made. On October the 16th, it was quite a famous manifesto, which already meant that he was already fleeing. He federalized the western part of the empire, but this was not something that the deputies sitting in the assembly did not approve it. And that was the time because they thought it was too late. It is quite interesting, the Hungarian regiments, this was raised in September, October, that they should be coming back. The minister of the military also told that when he was asked about that, because Palatine Joseph, who had very strong feelings for the Hungarians, was urging to do it, and it was quite justified that fighting at Isonzorpiave, would the Hungarians be fighting better than on some other borders of the country? Because this is what they were demanding, led by arts. The generals were not too keen to withdraw the troops from the whole territory. So here Hungarian interests were not really respected. The last prime minister was Wekerle, who resigned on October the 23rd, 1918. It's an interesting thing to look at this invitation, because October, on one hand, the local Croatian regiments revolted in Fiume, which created a big scandal in the parliament, which already shattered the Wekerle government. But the last drop in the glass was that the University of Debrecen, which actually has a very, very complicated story. First, it was established in 1912, but in 1918 it was inaugurated, but the real building was built only much later than that. So this was the last public appearance of the king, and the Czech infantry regiment was playing, but instead of the Hungarian hymn, they started to play the Gotterhalter, which was not in the Hungarian press for some reason. Nevertheless, in some minutes later, in the parliament, a big outcry started that it's already 1918, and instead of Hungarian hymn, we still have the Gotterhalter as the hymn. Later on, the royal casting started. The first story is that of Debrecen and Gödöllő. You know, the king wanted to relax at Gödöllő after December, so the king called Károli to Gödöllő and then invited him to Vienna, and then he said that okay, as he did not go, he sent a message to him that he will never become a prime minister. So he actually sent out a person who was called the Homo Regius in the person of Palatine Joseph. And there was one more, and the last decision. It was Lukasic, who was the urban commander founder of the Hungarians, and his memoirs, maybe it's just wisdom after the events, but he was a very hard-handed, very strong-handed, but it is a what-if question, and Charles IV never accepted it. And finally, our last picture. This is the picture that I took about his table, where he signed his letter of abduction. It was in Schönbrunn on November the 11th that he resigned from taking care of the state affairs. Then he went back to a hunting chalet in Akarcau, and it was intentionally a very, very complicated statement, but because it still ensured for him the opportunity to return. And the statement in Feldkirch, because the king left Hungary, he declared that he will withdraw his resignment, and he is not recognizing the changes of the Austrian state, and then he lived in exile. And just let me show you how the Austrians were treating the Habsburg family. The Habsburg family, which actually contributed to the independence of Austria and which made Vienna into an imperial city and not just a small town. So they were expelled, and all their fortunes would have been confiscated should they stick to the throne. So what happened of the Habsburg family in Hungary? They could all get into the upper houses and the very high representative rankings. All the Habsburg family members. Well, so much about the role of Charles IV, and I very much hope that I kind of gave first insights into events that will decide the fate of the rest of our country. And this is what you can see. This is Charles IV. Thank you very much for the presentation by Mihály Nánay. Here, what we have is that making the decisions is something that we are able to tell from our own lives. It's not easy to make a decision from our lives, especially then when there are such circumstances that the Hungarian monarchy was not really prepared for the war. And this was already quite obvious in 1915. And another important lesson that the historical psychology, that if there's a young, unexperienced person who is getting to the place, who has to make some decisions, and yes, there are many personalities in a lot of people, but instead of making a very hard decision, but it turns out that he was quite obstinate in sticking to these. So a new Austria is in the make. It's a kind of republic which is not following the legal continuation, and it was a confiscation of the assets and they were also expelled. And still, from the Habsburg fortune, they set up a fund for the victims of the war. So the Habsburg felt that they were responsible for starting the war.